So it is 4:02 p.m. on Monday, January 27th. I'm calling this joint meeting of the City Council and Bastrop Economic Development Corporation to order. We have a quorum of council present. I'll pass off to the chair of the BEDC.
All right, and it is now 4:03 on Monday, the 27th, and I'm calling this meeting to order as we have a full quorum as well.
Okay, so we'll move to item number 2, Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one and indivisible. Move on to item 3, citizens' comments. No citizens' comments. Move on to item 4, 4A, consideration, discussion, and possible action on the results of the sports complex feasibility study. Madam City Manager and Interim Executive Director.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. We have Hunden on the line, and I'll bring the Zoom meeting up so they can present. As you know, we went through a feasibility study that consisted of a small group of council and a small group of the EDC board to go through the potential for a sports complex within the industrial park and unused property. The feasibility study has concluded. Hunden will present the findings. Essentially, we may have missed the mark in terms of timing when we should have done a sports complex. We have many, many cities around us who are undergoing the same proposition, and it just does not seem like an appropriate project at this point in time. Hunden will go through the presentation, and then afterwards we may go through some potential options or future considerations. So, Hunden, the floor is yours.
And listening to the presentation, so happy to give a little bit of a wrap-up update. I think we've discussed with Sylvia and the team that we don't think that this is necessarily the end of the study, but we want to just be able to give you guys kind of an idea of where we're at, the discussions that we've had since we have walked through some of the financial exercises, both from a financial performance standpoint of what a potential project would look like, as well as the economic impact of it. And then just talk through some of our thoughts kind of as we wrap up the original scope of work. So without further ado, I'll kind of get into it. What we wanted to do before we get into the numbers, though, is recap kind of some of the main takeaways from the study. And as Sylvia had just mentioned, one thing that we have talked about throughout the process is just the volume of facilities that are in the pipeline at various different stages across different cities within the MSA and within the greater region. Certainly a lot of cities looking at comparable or similar projects, wanting to focus on sports tourism, using it as a means of economic development. So throughout the study, we took a look at a handful of these projects. One or two of them we're working with currently as well. So really, I think from a perspective of just understanding the greater development pipeline, lots of projects that would potentially be competitive to a project located in Bastrop. So just from the high-level perspective of the key findings and takeaways, we talked with a lot of groups on the baseball and softball side of things, soccer, basketball, volleyball, cheer and dance, as well as some other sports that influence the recommendations. So what we ultimately decided to model out would be the performance of a multi-purpose and multi-use outdoor sports complex with the capabilities of hosting both diamond sports as well as field sports. And we have the site plan that we'll recap here in a second with our friends at Convergence Design that did some mock-ups on the site. But overall, additionally looking at the increasing demand within the hospitality sector in the city of Bastrop, both from a leisure standpoint, but also from a corporate standpoint. So if the project was to be developed, wanted to stress the additional need for hotel rooms to capture all of the potential economic impact that the project would generate, as well as from a retail, restaurant, and entertainment perspective, wanting to have options for visitors to enjoy while they're in the market. So looking at additional group-friendly restaurants that could accommodate larger parties. Same thing from an entertainment standpoint, but just the key takeaway, wanting to focus on being a multi-purpose sports complex. So ultimately what we ended up modeling out was the capacity for 8 multi-purpose fields that would be set on 9 multi-purpose turf-sized diamonds. I know that can be a little bit of a tough concept, but we'll take a look at the site plan here in a second. But then also talking about a potential phase 2 indoor facility that we did not end up modeling out. We only stuck to the first phase of work for what we're going to be talking about here today. That would be the immediate needs and design for the facility. So as you can see, everything kind of right of my cursor in this section would be what we consider to be the recommendations for phase 1 of the project. We took some inspiration from a handful of facilities across the country that have begun to embrace the fact that they are turf surfaces and being able to line them for diamond sports, as I mentioned, but also having the amount of space required to put a full-size soccer field on. So on any given weekend, the facility could host a baseball or softball tournament, or it could host a soccer, lacrosse, or any other type of field sport, depending on what the demand for events would be within the project. So as we get into some of the financial exercises, that will be most of the new information that we'll go through here today. By stabilization in year 5 of the project, we projected roughly 25 events coming from softball tournaments, baseball tournaments, soccer tournaments, lacrosse, and then other. And as far as the utilization for event days, it ended up being close to about 52 event days that would total about 150,000 visitors just from the event side of things. That's excluding daily rentals that would tend to be happening Monday through Thursday at the facility. So by year 5, the total stabilization, again, looking at about 154,000 visitors from purely the events that would be hosted, and events meaning the tournaments and the sports tourism aspect side of the project. In total, for the pro forma of the project, we'll go through kind of some of the key takeaways here in a minute, but it's not uncommon, especially in the early years of operations, for these similar youth sports facilities to lose money on the bottom line or having a negative net operating income from operations. Typically, it takes about 5 years to build a robust event schedule and to become known as a destination to host events. So what we did over the first 5 years was ramp up the activity at the facility. And by stabilization in year 5, looking at turning a slight profit of about $72,000 in net operating income. Now, it's important to understand for projects like this, these are not facilities that are generating boatloads of cash and supporting themselves. They often require public subsidies. So in the early years when they're not performing but at the break-even level yet, it's important that it takes into consideration how long that it could take for it to become an established destination. So in total, by that year 5, looking at turning a profit, like I said, of about $72,000. So at the end, we can kind of go through any of the assumptions or any questions that you have. But the part that's important to focus on for the discussion today is the economic impact of what a facility like this could bring to the city of Bastrop. So when we ran through all of the visitation assumptions and the spending assumptions that would be associated with events at the project, over a 30-year time period, projecting about $823 million in net new spending. Now that's from direct, indirect, and induced spending, which would generate about $52 million in net new direct, indirect, and induced wages and earnings. And supporting about 25 net new jobs within the economy based off of spending that would be as a result of the project. So in total, from an economic impact perspective, we projected about $7.4 million in net new sales taxes within the city of Bastrop and about $6.2 million in net new hotel taxes generated by overnights from the events at the project. And one thing that we walked through with Sylvia and the team at the end of the project, and Mike, feel free to jump in if I miss anything here, but while working with the architecture firm on putting together the site plan, we looked back at past cost estimates for similar projects that we've worked on, as well as looking at the budgets of some of the case study facilities that we looked at throughout the process. And just important to know that our firm does not specifically do cost estimates for projects, but we have backup from a handful of projects that for discussion purposes, landed us at projecting that a facility like the phase one recommendations that we laid out would cost roughly $30 million in that ballpark. So wanted to understand from a debt service perspective on financing the project that in just laying this out in terms of the performance and how to support this project over time, we looked at the 5 years or year 5 by that stabilization with that projected 72,000 in NOI that would be available to put back towards the debt service of the project, as well as the projected $328,000 of economic impact that would come from those net new fiscal impacts in year 5, that there would still be a considerable gap on the funding that would be required to pay back the project. And there's two really important factors that come into the consideration there, and really it's when we did the financial projections for what those events and the utilization of the project would look like, we wanted to be conservative in nature, given the fact that there are a handful of projects, like we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation within the pipeline, that would be competitive with the project. So we wanted to be conservative with the estimates in terms of number of overall events and see how that would affect overall financing and debt service on the project. And as Sylvia said, at the end of the day, at the bottom line, we feel as going through these financial exercises that it may not be the right time to go to undertake this project, given the level of risk that's associated with all these other projects in the pipeline and the costly nature of these projects that has been certainly emphasized since the pandemic. Costs for these projects have gone up astronomically since youth sports tourism has kind of hit that boom in the industry once people realized that it was recession proof and paid off dividends significantly to folks that had these projects underway before COVID. But since then, the cost of these projects, as well as the difficult financing mechanisms, has made them pretty difficult to undertake and certainly risky from a public perspective of taking that risk on with the project. So one thing that we discussed is of course, we never want the answer to a study to just be, no, we don't think it's a good idea, and that's the last you've heard of us. So we'll talk through some examples of similar situations that we faced in the past. But one thing that we discussed with the team is that $30 million price tag that we talked about, again, was an assumption by us based on past projects that we've worked on. But it's not necessarily impossible to talk about taking this a different route in terms of development of a project, right? So throughout the study, we really felt passionate about the fact that the city is in need of additional sports facilities. Given the growing population and the surrounding population and where you could be pulling from to get potential user groups and where your residents currently have to leave the city to go to other cities that have these assets, as a major pain point for them. There's no doubt that we certainly agree there's a lack of facilities within the city for the residents to use, and that could potentially be the host of certain events. But when we talk about that $30 million price tag, we're talking about a facility that, with feedback from tournament operators from all over the country and from the industries that we work in, that talks about a tournament grade facility that an operator could say, these are all premium turf surfaces. If we bring an event there, we know we're not going to run into issues with the weather. We know we're not playing up on beat up grass fields. We're having a quality product that we can bring teams that are traveling from all over the region to, that we're not going to face these operational issues. So there's certainly a world where a facility of this nature, of this size, could be developed, but not with these prime turf surfaces that would really make it a destination for event operators to look at and say, hey, we want to routinely bring our events here. If it was meant to be more locally focused and a benefit to the community to still have a project developed where we're increasing the number of sports facilities that could be utilized by the residents, we would see significant cost cuts in terms of developing grass surfaces over turf, maybe not having some of all of the lit fields that would be required to help these tournaments be successful and as large as they could be. And you know, again, this is a point of discussion where we got to the end of the study and said, hey, this seems like it could be a pretty risky project in terms of what we projected the overall utilization would be. That's not to say that the project is totally impossible and never should happen. We just feel like at this time there's a significant amount of risk associated with what the project would potentially cost versus what the returns to the city would be. So really wanted to point out here that, you know, if there was to be an effort to develop a project that could be more locally focused, we'd want to set the expectation that if these were all grass surfaces, that it's not likely that we would project the same amount of events that would go there. It's likely that the facility would still host a handful of tournaments throughout the year, but they would likely be from compression at other facilities. So if a tournament operator in the Austin area needed a satellite facility to help support their event, it's likely that with this number of fields in one location, they would look to this as a favorable second option to host tournaments. But it's not likely that this would be the flagship facility that they would look to bring their primary events to. And you know, I think this is a good point to touch on, you know, kind of the expectations and kind of where the youth sports industry is right now. And you know, we talked with Greg and with Sylvia about the fact that stadiums, arenas, and convention centers, very similar to youth sports tourism oriented developments that carry these high price tags across the country, tend to be owned by the public sector for that pure fact that oftentimes it's the goal for them to break even on operations. Sometimes most of them operate at a deficit, as we kind of talked through with those projections of the early years losing money and not breaking even. They often require heavy public subsidies to facilitate those ongoing operations with the costly nature of them versus the revenues that they're able to generate. And really emphasizing the fact that they tend to be primarily public sector owned because of that economic impact that they generate as the return to the public sector benefit of investing in a project. We talked about the fact that it's very common practice for private operators to come in and operate these facilities mainly for two reasons. They are motivated by maximizing revenues and mitigating costs so that there is a surplus of net income available to service the debt on the facilities. They also look to maximize economic impact so that new sales taxes, new hotel taxes can be dumped back into and dedicated towards that debt service as well. And really where that comes into play is that they rarely invest equity in these facilities given their experience in the industry and knowing that they don't generate significant revenues or significant NOI at the end of the year that would be going towards the operator putting it back in their pocket. The way that they structure their business is they do a monthly or an annual management fee so that they don't have to be associated with the risk of those shortfalls on potentially not being able to pay back that debt service if it was a privately owned business. So again, we can talk through a lot of that. I know it can be a complex setup or complex kind of issue in how they operate their businesses across the country. So happy to have a discussion through that. But from an overall implication standpoint, the study found that the project would carry a significant capital cost for the city. The demand and financial projections for the project would not cover, from a high level, our projections for the annual debt service of the project, meaning that the city would provide ongoing financial support for the project over that 30-year period. The growing competitive supply proposed within the regional market and site constraints are notable threats to the project. But again, wanting to highlight that we're not saying that a project is impossible because we see the value in the quality of life improvements that a project like this would be provided to the growing population and potential new residents who would value a project like this as a means of differentiating Bastrop from other cities that they may potentially relocate to. So certainly wanting to touch on the fact that there are significant economic impacts that would be returned to the city, but at this time we do feel that it would be a risky project, given the fact that there are potentially other projects that economic development could pursue at this time. So, you know, again, as we wrap up the current scope of work, we never like to just say, you know, that was it and we're done here. You know, we typically like to stay on board if it is the case that we don't feel confident in recommending that you undertake a 20, 30, $40 million project. We talked about the fact that it's important to be honest in our opinions, given the demanded financial projections that we ran. So really quickly, just two similar scenarios where we've kind of run into this before. In Garden City, Kansas, the mayor of the city was heavily invested in the local youth hockey program and convinced the city council that they should look at an ice facility arena for the local teams to utilize. Well, our feasibility study found that there wasn't enough of a demand for the city to invest similar to this, roughly $30 to $40 million in a new facility. But instead, what we recommended was that they develop a covered outdoor sheet of ice so that they could, in the wintertime, use it as an additional ice sheet for the youth organization to utilize. And in the summer months, they could melt the ice down and use the covered pavilion for farmers markets or other community events. And I know that this is not a one-to-one comparison of the project, but there are important examples of how we could use what the study found to pivot to other potential ways to cater towards the local community, as well as potentially some other avenues of generating youth sports tourism. And then one more before I open it up for discussion, very similar to the last example, Cottage Grove in Minnesota hired us to do an arena study where the conclusions of the study were you don't need to invest $50 to $60 million in arena. You can develop more community-driven ice sheets that don't have the seat counts that are driving up the price tag of the project. And again, know that these aren't one-to-one comparisons, but now that we kind of have the implications of the study, we would like to take some time to kind of pivot and figure out what the appropriate options could be for what we could do with the data that we found and how we could make this a beneficial project to the city. So I know that's a lot of information to kind of go through, but wanted to spend the majority of the time here on discussion, answering any questions that you have about the study, about the findings, and you know, how we can be a resource going forward to the city, so that we can figure out, you know, what may be a better option, a better alternative. But Mike, I know anything I missed before we kind of open it up to discussion or questions?
No, a couple of things. First of all, we appreciate you being here. Ryan, could you put the map of the competitive nature up there so we can talk about that just for a minute, very early on? So this really kind of summarizes the market and really who you would be potentially competing against. I mean, and clearly you can see that there's a strong relationship to staying near 35 and the proximity to 35 for ease of traffic all the way down from San Antonio up to Temple. And while Bastrop is close to 35, it's not as close as Hutto or Pflugerville or anything like that. So if we are going to compete against these markets, we have to be, or you have to be, a premier facility, which is going to be in that $30+ million range. And if the goal is for that facility to break even and cover any or a substantial amount of its debt service, that's not what it's projecting out to be. Now, if that's acceptable to the council and to the various committees, that's okay. But we wanted to make sure that we had this conversation with you, that you see that this is a extremely potential competitive nature. And if you don't go big, then you're not going to get the big tournament. And then that will also then compress your economic impact. And we don't want you to be fighting for secondary tournaments with a large investment. So there's some strategy in here as well. There's some decisions that the council and everybody will need to make, which is if we're okay spending that money, knowing that we'll also have the best park district facilities or park or youth facilities in the area, and that's going to help us attracting additional residents, additional jobs, and some things like that, but it's not just an economic development. That's a quality of life discussion, but it needs to be factored into that $30 million price tag. So when we look at this, and this slide is really, I think, telling, so that you can just see what your competitive market looks like within that youth sports complex draw. And you all know that some of this already exists in Austin, Round Rock. Austin is rumored to be doing a major youth sports complex out at the fairgrounds, which, you know, in many cases they'd have to drive by that to get to your facility. So this to me kind of tells you what the kind of market is that you want to play in, and then what it would cost to play. So I think with that, we're probably ready for questions.
I have just not really a question, just a statement, because from the beginning of this, and Ron, correct me if I'm wrong, but this was to be an economic driver, correct?
Correct.
So with the information of the study, we found this will not be that. So that was our goal. And now we're talking about community, and so we're talking now about a whole different animal that is not BEDC involved. We're talking about a recreation center for our community. So that's a whole different thing. So I just see that, and I really, really love addressing things the way, that's the only way to do it, because I'd rather be broke than tired and broke, and I don't want to be either right now. So I appreciate the information, but just personally, I think if it's not an economic driver, then there's no point in putting our eggs in this basket.
Yeah, I'd like to add more of a statement.
One thing
than a
we talked.
question. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Answer the question, or answer.
I was just going to say that is one thing that we talked about with Sylvia, that, you know, as a next step, it may be appropriate to involve other arms of the city in the discussion. I mean, there's data and there's information that's valuable to the city that maybe at this time the messaging is that it's not an economic development initiative, but there are still benefits to other organizations within the city that this information could be very useful for. But we agree. That was what we had our conversation with Sylvia with last week is, you know, given all this information, this may not be an economic development play.
There will be economic development, and there will be impact. It will just not be enough to cover or to justify potential debt service payment if you're looking to have that to be one-on-one. So I think that it's clear. There will be economic impact. It just will not be a break-even or make money proposition.
All right, I have a couple of comments on this. First of all, the comments are I'm a little disappointed, to be quite honest with you. My disappointment comes in that on December the 3rd, or that week therein, you guys came and gave us the first update on this, and you already had the information, from my understanding, about all the other surrounding communities that were going to do this, yet you didn't really put any emphasis on that. And that was like, I don't know, maybe 30 days into the project, and yet you already knew that there were 6, 7 different communities that were going to do something very similar, number one. Number two, we told you right up front, we have no interest in operating this thing. We have no interest in putting up millions and millions of dollars. We want to use the land as collateral, either sell it or lease it, and then have an operator come in here and do it. And yet, you're finishing up this on this private-public partnership structure with basically there's nobody in their right mind that would go in here from a private enterprise because they simply don't make any money. So I guess I'm a little bit on the disappointed side that you pretty much knew that outcome already because you're in this business. You know it, and yet we're at the end of the contract and we're just now getting this as the finale. I'm sorry, that to me, I'm just very disappointed, that's all. Yeah, I'm just disappointed.
The impacts of knowing that it's a competitive marketplace. I certainly think that it takes having the conversations and doing the market study to land on numbers that we're comfortable with in those projections that would lead us to understanding what exactly that deficit or what that performance would look like. And as it relates to the public-private partnership, you know, I understand that through conversations throughout the process, it helps us understand that, yes, using the land as collateral would be an avenue to help fund this, but it wouldn't be enough from the city side or from the economic development side to make this project feasible. So I understand the disappointment, but it would take going throughout the process for us to come to these conclusions and feel comfortable making these recommendations.
I'm going to go back to what Ron said. Why did we not know this, that there were all these people doing these developments at the same time? Because, look, if I would have known that, I would have said, why are we wasting money doing this? Right? I think we're all kind of in agreement with that. I mean, if we know there's 9 people surrounding us that are all doing the same thing and we missed the gun, we should have been advised of that immediate. Should have been the first conversation.
Well, Ryan, I do understand that you needed to run through these projections and you need to get more information. That I can totally understand. And you wanted to come out with more, data-driven information to present your findings. It's just that it seems like a lot of these things you guys already knew about, especially the private portion of it, because that's exactly what we came to you originally with. We don't want to be the operators. So to me, that's kind of like the real big disappointment. And then, of course, knowing that there's every community around here is doing the same thing, we probably would have gone, well, great job. Thank you so much for finding out. Now that we know this doesn't look like it's going to fly, and we probably would have said thank you very much for your time.
Remember, one of the things we were looking at in the very beginning was, what is that sport? And remember, we vacillated between maybe we're going to become the cricket capital of the world. We don't know what that obscure sport would be based on what's driving here. So that was a portion of the research. I think the other piece that whether it's a public-private, whether it's a city-led event, all of the other cities are publicly owned. And I think we did all say that in the beginning, this is not going to be a publicly owned facility. But given that that is our competition, all up and down 35, I almost feel like they had to show that to you in case we changed our mind. Who knows? The city may have said, great, wonderful, let's turn this into a recreation facility. I don't think that's what we're going to say because $3 million debt service is a hefty price tag. But yeah, I think we had to go through the exercise.
Okay, and let me clarify. I'm not upset about what was being said as far as everybody else is going to be publicly. I understand that, and that's good information to know. It's just that I believe we were really very, very clear that we didn't want to, and it would have been nice to have that information much earlier in the planning project or phase of it. Thank you.
Well, let's make sure we clarify a couple of things. Those cities that we showed you, they are in various forms. Now, we know that in Round Rock, which is considered that Austin circle, they already have an existing sports complex. The other ones are in various stages. So I don't want you to think that there's 9 direct competitors that are coming online at the same exact time that you may be coming online, but you need to be aware of where your competition would be if you wanted to get into this market. So when we tell you that something's not going to make money, that doesn't mean that we don't think it's a good project for either your residents or to be in that marketplace. It's the decision that you have to make on whether that investment is worthwhile. There was another discussion that we had that was that if you were to do an RFP related to this property and entered into an agreement with the developer and there was a land transfer, some things like that, that unwind itself may have been harder than presenting you the bad news today, which is it may not be in your best interest to move forward with this. Because at that point, if that owner you'd already signed that over and they couldn't get the financing into the youth complex, you would then have lost control of that property. So some of this, we don't want to give you the bad news, but we want you to tell you the truth. And we also want you to be prepared that while we know you didn't want to run it, if we turned it over to a developer and you couldn't get it back, that's a 2 strike. And that's bad for all of us. That's bad for us, and that's bad for you.
Question, on the other cities, the other 7 cities that would be our competition, are they also doing a phase 1 and phase 2, similar scenario? Phase 2 will be indoors, and they've gone that route?
Well, and some of them are also doing indoor versus outdoor, so there's a mix of where they think their focus is. Some of them are looking at aquatics, and then they'll do the outdoor. Some of them are doing the outdoor, and then they're going to do the indoor because they want to focus on volleyball. There's been a push along 35 to do ice, and then others, their adjacent land to do additional fields once you've got a full building built that could be your center and your hub and your spoke. So they're all in different phases and with different maturations and with different programs. So they're not all phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Some are phase 1 with a main building and then fields to follow them. Some are fields with a main building. So they all have a different, and some we know and some we just have heard from street rumor. But sometimes street rumor doesn't get onto the street if there's not some validity to it. And that's our job to tell you that.
We need to turn it on.
My apologies. Greg Smith helping to project manage the effort. I just wanted to say that I think that, well, I know that some of the development pipeline conversation has really developed as we've gone through this. I think after the first time that we kind of had a presentation with Hunden, we were aware of, I believe, 2 or 3 of them. And I think at that we weren't sure where they were in the process because all of them are going through, I think, a similar process to what you guys are doing where they're also trying to determine what facilities they're going to build. And then I think over time, as Ryan and the team spoke with different operators, they learned about more and more projects. And, you know, we've landed at seeing that it is pretty congested. And Ryan, of course, can correct me if any of that's incorrect.
I do want to just say, with Sylvia and Greg, having that discussion about realities of the P3 structure before in December. And, I think that we wanted to have a touch point at that point to give you information about what those conversations looked like with the operators that we talked to, how potential land that the city would give to have with potential commercial developments would affect that decision. But, I just want to say, with Sylvia having that check-in in December, having a little bit of a level set on what the expectations would be given our conversations about this site and this potential development specifically. We did check in certainly with our concerns at that time on that.
Council, do you all have any other questions?
I just want to be sure I understand what you just said. So in December, we knew about this. Is that what you're saying? That you alerted the city in December that there were other projects going on?
Well, I think I remember when we gave our presentation in December, I'm almost positive, we can go back and look at the version that we showed you the same map with the potential competition that was there. If we did not stress it, we'll take that blame, but I'm almost positive that we showed you the competitive marketplace within Central Texas.
I don't recall. Does anybody else?
I do recall it. And so from the beginning, from the initial presentation, they talked about the complexes along 35. They also talked about the fact that Houston doesn't have a big market, and that was the red flag for me. As big as Houston is, and if they don't have a market for it, then why is little old Bastrop going to matter? So from that first conversation, I was kind of like, I don't think this is going to work out. So I'm not at all surprised with the outcome because they did mention that. And
I do remember
yeah,
talking
it was
about that. I
talked
just
about.
didn't realize there
Yeah.
were that many. So you're saying you didn't realize either until you did more research?
I think they're saying they didn't realize how far along those projects were, but they knew that that's where the sports complex driver was going, towards the 35 corridor, and they talked about between San Antonio and Dallas, that the traffic going that way and how were merging there. So they did talk about that. I don't so much, blame. I hate spending $60,000 on a study that, we're disappointed in, but I'm not surprised because of just from the initial presentation they gave, I felt like this wasn't going to work out for Bastrop. In the long run, and honestly, I'd rather spend this money on a recreation center.
I was much more positive feeling at the beginning on our other presentations, as you were, Ron, because I didn't know there was so much competition. Now we do, and it would make no sense. But we have to deal with what we have now, even though we've spent the money. The facts are the facts, and it's good to know that, and now we know what we're not going to do and what won't make sense, right? And let's go ahead and work on things that do make sense, I think.
But I also feel like it was good to go through this because it was part of our comprehensive plan. It was something people wanted us to explore as an option. We've now explored it. We see that it's not going to work out. And again, I go back to the demand right now is a recreation center, and I'd rather focus on how we can make that happen.
Just for the people listening, that's a whole different animal than what this was. A recreation center is not an economic driver, and it's certainly not saying we're diminishing the need for a rec center. That's absolutely the opposite. However, the funding and the mechanisms to get that are a whole different thing. So, and I think we are all in agreement because we hear from the people all the time that that is an important thing.
I totally agree with you, but my question now is, and forgive me if I should have asked this, but you know me. My question is, that land that we've been talking about developing, that's EDC land meant for economic development. Yes. We wouldn't consider putting a rec center on that land. Okay, I just wanted to clarify that.
That's actually an item on our board meeting later on.
Okay, thank you.
I guess there's always a but. But if the city wanted to purchase that from EDC at fair market value, but it's not an EDC project at that point.
And I think a recreation center could be an economic driver if we build it and program it and organize it the right way. There's some opportunity for it to be an economic driver, maybe not as big as what we were hoping this was going to be, but a recreation center can be an economic driver.
It can, or a convention center that meets the needs of Bastrop.
Just a point of clarification, please. Recreation center is not on the agenda. Yep. Therefore, I think we need to drop the conversation, if you don't mind. Yep. We were talking about a feasibility study of a sports complex. Yep. Thank you.
If there's no further questions for Hunden, Councilman Foster.
How often have you been able to pivot after a study and harvest some of the information and get different partners at the table? How often? I know you've done that some, but how often have you done that?
Different studies. I mean, in hotel and convention center studies, it happened as well. Talking about, expectations for how large a project should be versus what the market tells us and what the feasibility study tells us. So I would say that if I had to estimate, if we work on roughly 90 projects a year, it happens on 3 to 4 of them. We'll stay on board and try to figure out alternatives. I guess in this case, my biggest question would be this discussion that we're having right now is, with this information, does this become more of a locally focused project where it doesn't fall in the hands of the EDC? Correct. I think that's one thing to keep in mind, where if it's not something that we feel is going to generate the amount of sports tourism that it would be still an economic development play versus some other branch within the city. But I would say roughly 3 to 4 times a year, we're in a situation like this where we would say we don't feel confident in the overall recommendations and we should look to other options for a project.
Okay, thanks. We have other partners in the city and we have other nonprofits, but it just needs to not be discussed at this table with this particular group.
So any other questions for Hunden Partners? Okay. Well then, thank you very much.
Thank you. We know this probably wasn't the news you wanted to hear, but we know it's the news that you needed to hear. And while we appreciate that you're disappointed, we don't necessarily like to deliver bad news. I kind of like it. I tell people I don't like it when my doctor tells me I have to lose weight. I know he's right. I just don't like hearing it, but I know he's right. So we do appreciate working on this project, and it has been, we have learned a lot. This is a great market. It's just a highly competitive market, and your goals are different than maybe some of the other municipalities' goals, and that's okay. That's why you're elected, and you have to make the hard decisions.
Thank you, Mike. Madam City Manager, what kind of action would you like from the various bodies here?
From both parties, actually.
So moved from the city council side.
Second.
A motion from Councilperson Plunkett, seconded by Councilperson Meyer to cancel the project. Yeah, I know. Cancel the project, and is there any other qualifiers? We're just canceling the project?
I would say cancel the project as presented. If council wants to dive into some of the data that's presented in the
yeah.
report,
Other things, yeah.
but as presented as an economic development project.
Right. Okay, so the motion on the table is to cancel the project as presented. Madam City Manager, will you call the roll, please?
City Secretary.
City Secretary.
Councilmember Plunkett. Yes. Councilmember Meyer.
Yes.
Councilmember Fossler.
Yes.
Councilmember Lee.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously.
All right, then I'll entertain a motion along the same lines of canceling the project as it's been presented. All right, all those in favor of canceling, say aye. Aye. All those opposed? All right, the motion carries. Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll now move on to item 5A, discussion and possible action regarding the strategic planning session held by the BEDC on January 13th, 2025, and amendments to the existing BEDC policy statements. Madam City Manager.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. So the EDC had a strategic planning session on January 13th at downtown at Piney Creek. We looked at a couple of different areas before proceeding on what would be our 1 year. We really should be developing a 5-year, but we are in such a period of flux. 1 year at a time is the only thing that makes sense. If we have larger projects, for example, a build out of the park, those kinds of things, perhaps a longer term plan for capital improvements might be the place. I think 1 year to allow us to be able to pivot, be able to make any adjustments midstream would keep us agile and keep us able to be responsive to the outside forces. And Dory and Angela, if you guys want to take a seat at the table because some questions may be relevant to each of you. So we looked at the current environment. We looked at the regulatory environment around us, what changes to state law are occurring, where does the city and EDC agreement stand, what are changes that need to be made to that, what is our legal framework for EDC projects. We've consistently talked about needing to modify the EDC contracts as they come through for projects or the viability of a project, i.e. not transferring the land, perhaps entering into a letter of intent as opposed to an immediate sale at the beginning. We looked at what the business environment looks like. We have a new administration. What is that going to do to interest rates? From the development services side, the speculators abound. every single day, our phones have definitely hit an uptick in development services. And then what are growth projections for the city? How does the EDC keep up? How do we recoup some of that revenue that we lost with the allocation to the street fund? And then how do we leverage our resources? What partnerships are beneficial to the EDC and to the city, and what can it bring, and how does that advance our mission? And then what type of development agreements should we or could we enter into? Are there projects that are partnership projects with the county, for example, with the city? What does that look like, and what does that mean for the EDC board? And then we have that matter of perception. How do we overcome some of the perception that the EDC is an idle organization that has not contributed in the recent future? And when we went through this exercise in the downtown area, very much like the Visit Bastrop exercise of what happens if Visit Bastrop were to go away, or what happens if the EDC were to go away. The good feelings that remained from the EDC were part of the COVID grants that were provided, and that was the last thing folks could remember. And that's been a couple of years. And so there was market perception about, you used to do things good, what can you do now? And that really is a what can you do for me now? Well, the EDC can and should, but in what format? And then our perception of our partner at BISD. Very hard to attract quality development when the development focus is on a specific age group, and the first place those companies go look is the scores. And so how do we continue to be a foundational support to BISD partnerships to help overcome some of that perception, or perhaps also assist in moving that continuum? And so I want to just take a tiny look at, these are our growth statistics. This is by the year 2029, we should be right at about 20,000 in population. That's a market increase from our last 2010 census of 8,400 people. So in 2029, our median population is 41.4, and our average household size remains steady at 2.5. How you get a half a person, I'm not sure, but I think we've all been asking that. And then our renter versus owner occupied units. We've talked a lot about affordable housing. We've talked a lot about attracting companies and how their employees can or cannot afford the Bastrop area. And you see that median home value steadily growing from 296 down up to 368. Sorry, I should be following along in my own. To 368. So we do have some increases. Some of that is a function of value, cost of service, et cetera, but we are making moves along. So keeping all of those things in mind, how does that affect the companies or the businesses that we're trying to attract into the industrial park, or even overall? Per capita income, I'm sorry, that's not shown on this slide. Our diversity index also continues to trend upward. So we looked at we did a good old-fashioned SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities. I'm sorry, why is this one not catching up? Oh, I must be running the meeting from both computers. We did a good old-fashioned SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And by and large, the strengths were that we have a strong board and strong leadership made up of private and public individuals who understand Bastrop and understand our business environment. The growth and knowledge of the city, just because of Mr. Musk, and our location and proximity on 71 to Austin and the Houston corridors, obviously available land, which is in Dory's pillar today, and then our beautiful downtown and some of the strengths. Our weaknesses is we don't have a good track record of tooting our own horn. Some of us believe that we're growing too fast and that our infrastructure is behind or limited. Severe lack of transportation and lack of adequate road systems for traffic. And our opportunities, obviously our uniqueness, our image, land, the media, demographics, and TxDOT roads fixing to be in an expansion. Some of our threats are outside of our control. Our geopolitical issues, for example, if there is embargoes with China, we have a large business in the industrial park who is servicing a company in Tyler that we all know. And some of those things may have an input on what those companies can or can't provide. We have a small town outlook, but we're competing with big city experience and push and pull. And then we don't have any shovel-ready sites per se in the industrial park. The companies that have been presented have a low return on investment opportunity. The growing pains and not being proactive to recruit. Those are some of the things that we've seen as threats, or the board saw as threats. And to address some of those things, we worked on some pillars of 4 focus areas to begin to address some of those. The industrial park is first and foremost. We saw that the sports complex is not going to be a go. So that leaves us with some acreage in the park, and we have to begin to attract companies, decent companies that have good jobs and good return on investment. We have to continue to focus on workforce development. How do we do that? And that is through partnerships. I continue to tell the chair and the executive committee, I am not a teacher. We don't have any teachers on staff. We can be, but that's not our forte. So we should partner with those folks who can do that and do it well. Business attraction, retention, and expansion, that's Dory's lane. How do we identify those land swaths that are available? What do we do when we know they're available? Who are we reaching out to? How do we work with our partnership with Retail Coach? How do we help the small businesses downtown on Main Street, for example, continue their expansion? Or even any small business that walks through our door, how do we help them get past that threshold? And then again, how do we leverage those partnerships? So, pillar 1, develop and update a current map of the park. There seemed to be some concern that the park on the website was not updated. This is the most recent park and who's occupying said park. And so the established goal for that is February. I believe it's already been completed. And then market the park in 2 national and 1 global publication. So that means a partnership with Visit Bastrop. That means getting to know what we really have and who is our target company, who's our target market. Right now, we have a giant technological growth in the Austin market, and then we have the Plant and Taylor. We have the Plant and Taylor coming up. All of those spin off ancillary industries. Who is that and who should that be, and do those match with our needs and desires in the industrial park? We need to update and review restrictions and covenants. There's been a subcommittee of Angela, Chris, Cheryl, and Gary to review those and make recommended changes to the board. We will get that on your calendar with an estimated completion of 2025. There are some covenants that say you must have a shovel in the ground by such day. There are some architectural requirements in the covenants. Do those make sense? Is there anything we need to add? Is there anything we need to subtract? And next goal was to clear and minimally improve platted streets to allow for a better marketing of the industrial park. And so we met with the streets department. Angela provided a map. There are some areas that we will be focusing on. For example, getting some semi-improved surface here and some semi-improved surface here that would allow for the showing of the park. Minimal investment. EDC will provide the materials, city staff will provide the labor and the equipment that will get that park able to be shown a little bit better. And that expected goal is March of 2025. Any questions before I move on to the next pillar? Okay. Yep.
Okay, on the streets. Let's see. I know we went round and round previously about where to put the streets and all of that kind of stuff. There's a bit of a cart and horse situation, depending on who goes and how big they are, how many streets you need. If you get a really big factory or facility, then you may not need the streets that we wind up building. So there's always that. And then also, I believe what's platted is do you remember what the number was for that? Because just to put the 30 million in perspective and I know that we've canceled the previous project, but just to put that in perspective,
It was about 16 million.
Yeah, we're talking 16 million just for streets.
Well, it was
So-
streets, water, wastewater,
Yeah, but
drainage.
just the infrastructure just to get you there.
So, yeah, the improvements that we're talking about is really just taking the skid steer, taking the bucket, clearing the land. So
You're
yes.
right. I get that, but
Okay.
we know we just need to realize that we're on the hook for, those infrastructure improvements, most likely one way or the other.
Right, but also let's keep in mind that back then, when we discussed it, there was not a developer fee, was not even on the books yet. So that has changed one thing. And yeah, just to add on to what Sylvia just said, yes, we're just talking about like a construction entrance where you could actually drive a truck so people could literally see the property, especially just in those two locations. That's all we're really discussing.
And Financial Way has been recently improved, so that gives access to this portion of the park. A improved surface with some bull rock will give access to this lower portion of the park. This portion of the park has some concerns, as this roadway that should have punched out won't punch out now because there's now an overpass there that would go straight into a wall. So minimal, but just to get the park back at the forefront. Again, working with Visit Bastrop and getting our marketing efforts, and you'll see that in the next couple of pillars. So pillar number 2 is workforce development goals. So we need to understand what the business community really needs. What is that? Right now, Career Tracks, which is previously the Smithville Workforce Training Center, they had phlebotomy and banking and accounting, they have welding, they have et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There is a difficulty in placing some of those people now, for example, in the welding portion of it. So what are the business needs and how often are we revisiting those needs? Dory comes from a place where there was business roundtables, and she can expand more on that if you guys want her to, and to really understand what are the needs, and then how do we get that need met through what type of partnership. Again, we're not the teacher, so what does that look like in terms of support and to whom? Right now, we provide support to Workforce Solutions, and we have a partnership agreement with Career Tracks. One of the things that Dory set up, I don't know, I guess it's been about a month ago, was a roundtable of these type of partners. And the consistent theme over and over and over again is childcare. How do we get childcare to Bastrop? How do we meet a need? Well, the city has taken steps. We gave a 50% tax exemption for daycare. And from a workforce development, they tell us there is large pots of money for companies wanting to start a childcare that is a STAR accredited, meaning listed on the state site that meets certain criteria. So one of the discussions we've been having is how do we let folks know that that's there? How do we help transition those in-home childcare services? How do we help them transition to STAR level services? How do we open up those avenues using what we already have instead of trying to recreate a wheel? And then again, the quarterly roundtable with our partners. They need to tell us what's needed, what isn't being met, what type of grant parameters are they expecting us to fill as it relates to the dollars that were acquired and met. Any questions?
So do you know if there's anything TWC can help us with in this area?
Texas Workforce and Workforce Solutions will be the partner. I think from a what's the immediate need, it always goes back to childcare and transportation.
How does TWC help with that? That's what I'm asking. Is there anything that we can do at the state level to help with workforce solutions or help with training or help with funding for childcare businesses, things of that nature?
You're not on.
Hello. They can help with funding for new child care centers that open up in Bastrop, and that's one of their primary functions when it comes to child care. And then, of course, for enrollment and families that need child care, they can also help with subsidizing that. They have also requested that anybody in Bastrop, the full county, who's interested in sitting on the board would also really benefit them in getting the needs of our city and county to the state level. That's another thing that would be helpful for them. So really it's funding when it comes to childcare facilities. That's a huge benefit that they can absolutely be there for.
Sylvia, were you saying that they partner with Workforce Solutions to do that? So you would be communicating through Workforce Solutions to get that information?
That's our partner who's been at the
Okay.
table.
All right, thank you.
They're the ones that let us know that there is $1 million pots of money for new child care center availability.
May I make a comment on this one
Sure.
as well? Just as I saw later that you are looking to partner more with the Bastrop Chamber, which I know you guys have a lot already, and this is on their advocacy plan for 2025 also, like very clearly stated at accessible and affordable childcare, and they have, I mean, it's one of their very strong priorities this year. So I encourage that y'all to always be at the table together when tackling this.
I believe it's a priority for Bastrop County Cares as well. There is a group led by Molly McClure, who also, there's a group of women who are, trying to tackle the problem. Pillar number 3, business attraction, retention, and expansion. So we have reinvented our partnership with the retail coach, Visit Bastrop. So land banking, again, that's Dory's role to create a repository. If a company does come and they're looking for a specific criteria of land, how do we know who owns it? How do we know if that property owner would be even amenable to it? And when I say land banking, I don't mean that we're going to be the realtor. I don't mean that at all. I mean we at least know that we can make the introductions and facilitate any of the meetings. Established goal for that is March of 2025 and continuous. So Visit Bastrop is creating a marketing video and enhancing our advertising. Again, this goes back to tooting our horn. This goes back to even understanding where the industrial park lies. We talked a lot about ICSC, the shopping center convention annually, and what it would take to get prepared to make a trip to Las Vegas annually or the Dallas conference. Dory is going to take a one-day trip to the Dallas conference, which is, I believe, Thursday, to get a lay of the land and understand what help Visit Bastrop would be able to provide for us in terms of brochure and et cetera, et cetera. Then monthly updates on Retail Coach. And so that's going to be in your regular agenda. We always seem to operate in the dark as to know who's coming, and a lot of times community impact, no offense, sometimes knows before we do. And, how is that? Well, sometimes there's a lot of chatter. Sometimes it's pulling of building permit or information or other sources. We'd like to stay at the cusp and know what that is before it enters the door into development services, because part of Dory and Angela and my job is if it enters the door, we help facilitate it going through the process so that we can make sure that some of these new businesses and retailers don't have a bad experience with development services and permitting that spreads quickly. Many of these groups come as groups. You will see the Darden Group, for example, that will bring a Longhorn and an Olive Garden, and they have a variety of other chains under that umbrella. To kill one means we essentially kill many, because any experience of the parent group doesn't bode well. So it's incumbent upon us to know what's happening, know who's looking, and that's our arm for Retail Coach. Any questions? Okay. We move on to our partnerships, and it's a lot more partnerships than probably are even mentioned on the screen, but continue building partnerships with BISD, the county EDC, Adina Lewis, who we often operate, again, in silos from one another, the city, the Chamber of Commerce, and our area utility providers. Shocking, Bastrop isn't the only one that provides water and wastewater in the area. And we do have some of the greater investment in those areas. So how do we leverage that resource so that we can actually cost share and perhaps reduce some of the cost of infrastructure overall? And then quarterly meetings with each partner organization. I did not put BPNL up here, and I should have, my oversight. Bastrop Power and Light actually services a very small footprint within the city, and the rest of the county is Blue Bonnet Electric. And so Josh Coy used to be a partner at our Thursday development meetings. He has since moved on. They have a different person. I met her. They will continue to be partners at our Thursday development meetings.
Sylvia, let me add on to that if you don't mind. I guess it was about a year and a half ago we had our first joint meeting with all of these partnerships, and it went pretty well, and we learned that there's a lot of stuff we don't know what each other entity is doing. So by putting these things on a quarterly basis, not only do we have a much better understanding of what everybody's doing, but part of the outcome of that was, why can't we share some kinds of resources? Because every department has an engineering and a permitting and all this other stuff. It seems like there's double and triple duty in a lot of these things. So this is a real big thing in my book, to have these on a quarterly basis so we can really keep abreast of what is really going on with all these different entities.
That was the leadership summit that you mentioned. And then the other is continue to support the We Believe in BISD. That's an initiative that is in the double digits year old, and we continue to support that. And that is the teachers provide a wish list of student needs, et cetera, and we continue to be positive supporters of the work BISD is doing. Any questions? Okay. It's not quite adjournment, because on our no. No, not quite. Within the strategic planning session, as some of the board members are looking at the EDC policy statements and looking at the information, like, for example, do we want to continue to stay involved in film? And if you give me a moment, I'm going to bring that document up that CC can, I will share in the live document, CC. So in your packet, you had a red line version of priorities and BEDC performance. So I'm going to bring up two portions of that really quickly. So the Bastrop of 2030 is anticipated to have a growing economy, attracting capital investment, a fully built out and occupied business park, a comfortable and thriving historic downtown, a thriving commercial corridor, connected and diverse neighborhoods that include quality housing, engaged and thriving public school system, and successful partnerships. Does anybody believe those priorities have changed or need to be added to? It's 2025, 5 years. Dory's taking that challenge.
Are we talking about the priorities? Did you
the
just go
tape.
over the priorities?
Mark the tape.
Yes, just the priorities.
Okay, one thing I noticed was that E, it says connected and diverse neighborhoods that include quality housing. One of the interesting things also back to the Chamber's advocacy plan, though I really liked their wording. This is how they stated it, promote the development of income-aligned and diverse housing solutions to meet the needs of all residents, helping to attract and retain a skilled workforce in the community. So quality is one thing, and income aligned for the people who live and work there is another. So I don't know what you're going for. I don't know if you're going for just a certain quality or if it's, I just liked their language. And yours, I'm not quite sure what you're going for.
So really, the EDC's limit would be, not that the EDC can't participate in affordable housing, that has not been the focus. And so when we think about housing and we think about that income-driven housing, what could the EDC partner in? If there's a retail segment, for example, that's part of that, there's maybe some infrastructure expansion or those kinds of costs that the EDC could participate in. I'm not sure what the chamber means by income aligned. And I say that simply from the fact of our per capita income is high and growing higher because of our influx of folks. One of the things we talked about the other day was one of the downsides of all of the professionals exiting Austin and Houston and moving to Bastrop is that the per capita level rises and the area median income rises.
Right.
And affordable housing is based on a percentage of area median income. So we end up sliding the table up, and over.
And we're in the Austin MSA anyway for that calculation. Okay, so more commercial connected, so much more about the streets that connect the neighborhoods? I don't know, just.
What if you took that word and just changed it to affordable versus quality? Does that make more
Well,
sense?
it's not your priority,
So
though.
it's not the
It's not
priority?
your priority, right?
Who's going to define affordability? That's not the business that we're in. And when you look at all the homes and all the rental property that's coming on the market in the next 5 years, it's, what do we figure, 12,000, 14,000 new rooftops coming in here? So I think it's a little early to be talking about affordable.
So
do y'all want to
I
talk
just
about
wonder what
housing
the
at all?
goal is.
Yeah,
Like,
the
what
question
the
is,
goal of
should we
that?
even,
Should you even have
is
a
housing
bullet?
a priority for BEDC?
I don't.
I don't think
that
it is.
It's in your wheelhouse if you choose it, but it's also, if it's not a priority, then I think you should take it off, because it's a little, I think it's a little misleading.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's good input. That's a good input. Yeah, I think we should take it off because I don't believe that we have, as a group, come to any consensus about making it a priority, right? Okay. Yeah, of course.
So, okay, so the recommendation is to remove housing.
What I do think
2E.
should continue to be left on there is to promote film in Bastrop County. And that was on there at some point, and I understand the reason I believe it was put on there is when you guys were dealing with Alton Butler and his studio, but being that that's coming in, that is still going to be something the city, it's clean, it's green, you know, it's something you want to continue to attract, not just countywide, but to Bastrop itself.
So the city itself is a film-friendly community. When a permit comes in, we trip over ourselves to issue it within 48 hours. So where in your mind do you see the BEDC fitting into promoting film? And I asked that because our prior director took that as a trip to California, but.
Well, all of California's coming here, so that's not an issue. But where I see it is, as the studio comes up, you're going to want to attract more businesses that work around that studio. Just like when Tesla came up, you want to attract those businesses that are subcontractors, right? And I think it's going to be the same as the studio goes fully online. You know, maybe that's a year, 2 years, who knows, but I wouldn't rule that out. Attracting those other businesses.
Let me make a recommendation then, because what we're doing right now is we're looking at a one-year forecast, right? And I think that for this year of 2025, we're not there yet. I believe that we can get there. We can revisit this next year when we want to update this thing. Not get it out of the way, but just as a priority, I don't think it's a priority just yet would be my recommendation. Let's review that next year.
And my feeling for that, TJ, is it really film or is it, again, some of that ancillary industry? So my feeling is if Alton's studio develops, The business park is within super proximity. Many of those may want to develop in the business park. And so at that point, we would take a look at it from an economic development project. Does that project make sense? It doesn't necessarily have to be film. It could be the lighting, it could be the grip, it could be 9,000 other things that I'm not familiar with. I just know those two words.
I noticed one other thing. So next to number 2, it says priorities. It says the Bastrop of 2030 is anticipated to have. It actually doesn't talk about your priorities. So I don't know if we should remove housing because it is the Bastrop of 2030 will have that, or maybe we should change that top part of.
This is your prior document that we're working off of, so I'm open to modifying.
Okay. That's kind of like where you see the city, and then number 3 is like where you see BEDC in it. You know what I'm saying? Is number 2 y'all's priorities, or is it what you expect that Bastrop will be?
This was a city council-led strategic plan that the chair has. Please comment.
We're just updating this. Let me just put it like that, all right? And that's why you have a lot of, the next document below this one in your tablet is the red line version. We're working on it. I think the point we need to take away with this is that some of the things that we had prior may not exactly fit. We're trying to focus in on a one-year viewpoint. And so, yeah, that 2030 should probably be taken out because that doesn't really reflect what we're trying to accomplish, at least in this session and in this year. We can always revisit it on an annual basis and update it, especially when things change, like what you were saying about some of the film or movie stuff. But right now, I just personally don't think that the housing we have not made it a priority. And so until we make it a real priority in that year we're working at, I think we should just kind of drop it off of this one.
The other thing to note about this is a policy document from the city council to the EDC, from the parent to the child, instructing them on these are what your priorities are. So when it was given to the EDC, I don't believe this dialogue took place beforehand. But even so, it's time for that dialogue, but it's also, if there's something that the council wants on there, then it goes on there.
That, like you said, that 2030, that's what threw me off. I'm like, what are y'all talking about? You're talking about 1 year, but here you have all these years, right? So I agree. Yeah, that needs to be removed.
Yes, those were city priorities, your BEDC performance. So the city will rely upon the BEDC to exhibit leadership in blank. Business recruitment, as recommended by the board and approved by the city council, maximization of the park, business retention and expansion with a special focus on small business, workforce development, support and marketing of the industrial park, which I think is really number 2 also. Enhanced legal support. Any questions on those or other recommendations?
I really think it's important that I know the commercial corridor kind of speaks to retail, but I mean, I think what the citizens really want and what the EDC really needs is retail, because that's where the sales tax gets collected. That's what's going to drive revenue at the EDC, and it's also what's going to drive happiness from from the citizens, because they want more options. They want to stay closer to home, to buy. We want to bring people in from out of town, from further away. They already come from a long ways off. Let's, let them spend more when they're here because they'll have more options. I think retail is super important, especially in the coming couple, 2 or 3 years, because there's a lot of that. I think there's a lot of commercial pent-up demand because of how difficult permits were in the previous, 5-6 years, and we're able to start bringing some of that on now.
Would you like to title that improve cooperation with retail coach to attract retail? I mean, that's the whole purpose of our partnership with the retail coach Or I'm happy to have any other.
At one point in time, we discussed Retail Coach being kind of a leader, but aren't there other entities out there that do a similar, that have maybe different site selectors that could also bring additional, opportunities to us?
There's more than, yes, there's more than the Retail Coach. They're the 800-pound gorilla in the sector. We're happy to explore others, but I'd like to capitalize on Retail Coach for just a little while, seeing as we just re-engaged them to see what they can actually bring to the table this year. And you'll see some of that in your presentation for BEDC. Any other comments about adding a retail bullet?
I think we should.
Okay.
I mean, one of the things that ties to that retail bullet is that I think that the EDC should be looking to maximize future sales tax growth. And, one direct and obvious way to do that is through bringing in additional retail. And then maximizing the business and industrial park, that is likely to bring in additional ad valorem taxes, property tax. So that also brings in additional taxes to the city. So that one contributes to that goal as well. But yeah, we're basically looking for future revenue growth, and that the EDC should be looking at that.
Yeah, to me, if the EDC did nothing but retail and jobs, then I think everybody would be super happy.
Right. And I think everybody can agree to that, but we still have to go back to what was stated earlier in the program, and that is basically that one of the things that is a little bit of a weakness is when companies come to look at setting up, what's the first thing they look at? That's the scores of the schools. So we need to work with our partners to see what we can do to help, if there's anything that we can do to help, to maximize that as well. But you're right. Other than that, I'm agreeing that that's not a bad idea.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, moving along to strategic planning. This is actually required in the agreement, so we need a multi-year strategic plan that's to be reviewed 5 to 7 years. This is an annual strategic plan. That's this plan. And really, this is to get us to a point of we know how to plan, we know what we say should be delivered, we have an actual deliverable, we can be accountable to the citizens. And then we're still working on what a pro forma looks like for the business park. What type of companies are we intending to bring, and what type of salary use, et cetera. And then the business incentive program, that's our revolving loan fund. You'll see that in the regular EDC meeting, and we finally sort of got past that hurdle. And then metrics. Some of this ties back to incentive payments. Some of this ties back to our legal contract and how we can make sure that we protect ourselves a little bit better. Any questions?
How will we report metrics?
So that's a return on investment. So the board has to make a decision. For example, I'll use Accutronics. Number of jobs, stated salary, how many of those jobs are intended to live within the Bastrop corporate limits, what is that impact to all of the funds and expected sales tax and property tax generation, and does that even make sense as a project to incentivize?
We've used an ROI calculator to tell us some of those things historically. Do we still have access to those?
We have access to that ROI calculator. It is not an ROI calculator I would recommend.
Okay, are there others for that? I mean, because certainly we could go and create our own model based on that, based upon the different types of inputs that you said and others that you didn't. It will be wrong, and everyone that gets created will be wrong, but it's just, how badly wrong is it, and how badly off is it, and you measure how badly off it is and why, and then you correct over time. But yeah,
and that's one of the things I mentioned.
But you have to start.
To the executive committee, that we are served right now with an Excel spreadsheet as opposed to going and spending $25,000 or $30,000 on a software. If we know what key questions are important to the board, then we can program that into some type of spreadsheet that's pretty easy to understand.
The metrics piece of this one is really important to me, and I really would like to see something along the lines of a 1-year ROI and a 3-year ROI, at least right now, and then as we go forward, a longer term ROI on that looks at the tax dollars into the EDC and then the financial benefit and then the qualitative benefit, because some things you wouldn't be able to easily, you wouldn't even be able to imagine how you could measure them in dollars, and so you can just report them as a, we accomplished this goal and provided this kind of training or whatever that is. But the things that you can imagine how to turn them into a tax benefit to the city, we create that model and articulate what we think that benefit is. This is hard to do, but I think if we sit down and work through it and argue about it a little bit, we'll come up with something, and then refine it.
Yeah, what you're saying makes sense. We just need to come up with the right model, the right program, whether we develop it or there's one off the shelf we can get. And as you stated, they're not all going to be 100% correct. They're all projections, right? But we do need to, the last one we had, and you may even remember it, John, every time we're in executive session and we're going through it, we're like, well, where did that number come from, right? Point to the fact that we did not have a good program. So we do need to get a much better program, and then we can start putting these types of things and making sure the metrics we want to keep tabs on are the ones that, that the city wants to look at. And it's the taxes, the jobs, the kind of ad valorem taxation, property taxes, things like that. But yes, we have to make good decisions on which companies we want to bring in. They're going to give us the biggest, bang for the buck, so to speak, right? And that's
and I agree. And that biggest bang for the buck is something that you can use a model like this to project forward in time. But I'm looking at this as a backwards-looking projection, where we would look at the historic performance over the last 1 year and last 3 years of the EDC. And so we know how much tax dollars went in, and then we estimate how much tax dollars came out of those activities, out of the economic development. And it's an interesting topic. How do you estimate the tax revenue generation out of building a street, spending $1 million on building a street? It has some economic development purpose, or we wouldn't have been able to spend money on it. So that's kind of, one of those things that we have to think through and figure out that, if we did not spend that money on that street, how much lower would our tax revenues have been? And what benefit did we gain in an economic sense from that? And it's a hard problem, but working through that will allow us to...
We work through it every single day. And I'll just use an example that you'll see later on also, is a business that wants to come in and needs assistance to build a road or et cetera, et cetera. We look at, okay, what would be the overall cost all in for the EDC as part of a request? Is that a partnership that can happen with the city? Yes, no, maybe so. Is that a partnership that can happen with TxDOT? Yes, no, maybe so. What is the amount of value that's going to be put on the ground from an ad valorem? That's the first place we start. Then we say, what's the expected sales tax generation? That's the second place. What type of jobs is that going to bring, and what income level are those jobs, and what skill level? If it's minimal, those have a sales tax impact. Each one of those jobs has a sales tax income, right? Impact, because the lesser the income, the less disposable income that employee has, and the less they're able to spend themselves on sales tax. So that's spin-off. So there are multipliers through that, and we look at that through every project that comes in the door that wants to have some sort of assistance. And if it's a duplicative project, the same restaurant we have down the street, for example, is that something we really want? Where does that other home restaurant land in the whole table of sales tax, et cetera?
Well, the other question is, will the project not take place if not funded by the city in some capacity? And sometimes that's a game of chicken.
Yep. Okay. Moving on to the next slide. We're almost done. Coordination. This was in the policy before. It was a struggle. It's I think I had to get the attorneys involved to get the non-disclosure agreements for the board to even be aware. And we chuckle now, but that wasn't a practice of the prior administration, wasn't a practice of the prior director to even share with the board this information. The lawyer stepped in and said, what the heck? What do you mean you're not sharing that information? Of course the board gets to hear that information. And so now we regularly share those. But through that has come this lens of, oh, we're required to provide that, or we promised that? What are we thinking? So the more transparent, the more information available. And then Dory and Angela are also at the table on Thursdays for any pre-development meetings or development meetings as they come through. They're at the table with the county, they're at the table with TxDOT, they're at the table with BISD. So we do have improved communication across the entire platform. And then part of tooting our own horn, press releases, right? When did the press release for LNS come out? It hasn't. When are we going to get the press release for Accutronic? Well, that one we got out because it was an Austin Statesman article, but we're waiting to get the press release out for T adhesives and some of the other ones that can show how good of a job the park is doing or can be doing and how we get further traction on that. And that's the public relations part of it. So, okay, Councilmember Lee, there we are.
Motion to it. Oh, see, that's a question.
No way, I'm not
I'll
happy
hold
with
off.
No way, no way, sorry. Can we go back to 2 and 3? I want to
Yes.
I want to get the wording precise. I mean, is this what we're doing in this meeting, or do you need to do
You're
this
making
offline?
recommendations.
Okay.
You're making
I
recommendations.
recommend you change 2 to city priorities, because it's
Okay.
really like what the city is saying, the priorities, and then 3 for BEDC priorities. So number 2 can still be the 2030 city's priorities, and then BDEDC performance, like in this fiscal year.
Okay. And we did calendar year simply because.
for sure.
Yes.
However.
It's hard when the boards are seated in November and the fiscal year has started, so we did calendar year.
So, and then G, what was one of those? Oh, F, and engaging, just change engage to engaging and thriving for F,
and
F for the
engaging,
second
okay.
word. And that way it's clear whose priorities are whose, so we're not. This is what I do, yes.
No, when Sylvia read it out loud, she read it grammatically correct, but it's not
Yeah.
correct on the slide, yeah.
That's what the brain does.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
Maybe it's in your red line.
I think on number 2, I think all that stuff makes sense for 2030. Yeah, I think, does that sound more clear to y'all? I don't want to push, okay, because we want to keep the vision and then your part this year that we can do measurable things for, right?
Well, so under number 2, since we're going back to that, are you excluding the quality housing on E?
Oh, I think that's still a city priority, and it's general enough and that's what we're doing, but that does not fall under BEDC priorities.
Right, that's under city.
Yep.
Correct.
City and the BEDC.
So that's why she wants to label number 2 city priority. She wants to give it a correct label up at the top to make sure that's not confused with a BEDC action.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can see how this 1 year fits into the 2030 vision.
Nope.
So you know where your focus area is for the year. Thank you.
So, question for legal. The workforce development projects, the statute for economic development allows us to do that under a couple of circumstances. One, you have to have a written agreement with the other party to employ the people that are trained or bring their prevailing wage up to the level that is appropriate for that training. You can also take on a project with a something secondary educational institution And so I've always kind of struggled to see how the types of things that we actually end up looking at for workforce development fit into those, because they don't seem like they do. Was there a third category that came in because we are under 20,000 in population and that gives us more flexibility on what we can do for economic development projects, or is it that it must meet the strict definition of the workforce development as defined in the statute for us to fund a project?
No, the under 20,000 population provision states that you can undertake a project if the board finds that it promotes new and expanded business development. And so to the extent that you have a project, or for lack of a better word, I don't like using that word because it has a very specific meaning under the statute, but you have a project that you want to spend funds on, and you have the appropriate findings that will expand new or existing business development. I'm sort of paraphrasing it. Then yes, you can do it, but it still has to meet that requirement of the under 20,000 population of expanding or new or existing business.
And would that be in the whereas clause, for instance?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah, it'd be in the whereas clauses. So we would say, I can't do it without knowing what the project is. We'd have to take a look at it and
Right.
and analyze whether or not it does it. But then we would make the appropriate findings and those legislative findings as part of the project.
I mean, the BEDC funds an existing kind of training program that will help people get their GEDs, and 5 or 6 things that they focus on, and none of that includes a written agreement that says they're going to get jobs from the body that we're paying to train, and so on. So it just does not fit under
Right.
the statute's definition.
I don't disagree with that. And I was trying to think of a black and white example is why we were sitting here chatting about it. And the one that pops into my mind is you have although it's actually part of the business, it's actually probably one that kind of fits under the statute, but you have a couple businesses come in that require some technical expertise, and you agree to pay for all of the training for that, but you don't require them to comply with the other provisions of the statute because you can do it under the 20,000 population. So you have the appropriate findings that says we're going to do workforce development for these businesses because if we do it, they will locate in our community, or if they're currently located, it will help bring workers into that business. That's a black and white example, I think. And you could do that without having them to do the prevailing wage increases and do all those other things.
I think the higher order question that I'm contemplating while asking you these questions about the law is in the ballpark of to what extent can the BEDC fund things that deal with job training and Smithville workforce, and it doesn't seem like it fits unless we can use that 20,000.
I would agree with that 100%.
That it does not fit.
Yes, the things that I've been hearing,
Uh-huh.
no one asked me, but only because we didn't have a specific conversation about it, but I didn't see them fitting. I did have some conversations with staff, I think, but I didn't see them fitting. But again, you can use the 20,000 if you find the right project to do it. Under 20,000 population exception. And you should utilize, I was going to say something earlier, but since you brought it up, it's sort of non sequitur of what we're talking about now. But you should really try to utilize that, especially with your retail. I heard something about retail. Once you get over 20,000 population, you're going to lose the flexibility to do those retail projects, because except with infrastructure, for example, because there is no project authority for a retail project. But yes, utilize that under 20,000 population while you can. But it can't be arbitrary and capricious, right? You can't just throw whereas clauses in there and think that you're in compliance with the law. We have to have some discussion and analysis as to whether or not it does meet the requirements, which is, promotes or expands new or existing business development.
Okay. So I guess this just leaves me continuing to struggle legally with what we can do in terms of workforce development.
And if that's the point that you're getting to, then maybe what we do is when a project, I know you don't like that word,
Right.
but when a project comes up, that is thoroughly discussed with legal to make sure it fits within the confines of the regulations, right?
Well,
And if we
certainly,
simply
yeah.
can't do it, then we're going to need to have a different conversation about that specific priority.
But as a, a focus for the body, it's one of those things where it has such specific requirements that I would fully support if we had something that fit that we should do those things. But when it comes to, say, partnering with BISD, well, okay, we can develop relationships and talk, but we can't spend money.
Well, and let's kind of step back just for a minute. I think one of the things that we're trying to do is be more of a facilitator to these roundtables, to get people in front of the right audience, right? I'm not suggesting we throw tons of money at a workforce development. I don't think we've even considered that or talked about anything that comes into that realm.
Well, no, I'm
But-
more concerned with any money, not tons of money.
Well, I mean, we
Yeah.
haven't spent any that I, we
Well,
haven't
no,
really
no,
spent
we
anything.
do have an item, don't we, that it's like a 20K number from, no, not that.
No,
It's not on the agenda now, but it was in the last budget. There was a thing that funds an organization that does GED and,
Oh, community action.
yeah, if that's being funded under the workforce development, it doesn't fit the parameters of the law.
I don't know, Charlie, it's been funded for, I don't know, 3-4 years now. It's not a new funding
No, and I know
source.
that, and we need to have a deeper conversation about that, yeah.
But did I misunderstand what was said? Because you said right now we fall under that 20,000, so we can make those exceptions. But once we're over 20,000, then it's a different ballgame. Am I
When we're
wrong?
under 20,000, we haven't had the comprehensive discussion on that yet, but we do have the ability to find that something does promote economic development and then spend money on a project for that. But legal told us that we can't just put that standard whereas clause in there and be covered. It has to legitimately meet whatever those goals are.
And that would be, workforce development would not fall under that?
So workforce development, as defined in the statute, most of the things we have talked about for workforce development can't be funded unless we can determine via a process we haven't created or discussed that it contributes towards this under 20,000 economic development.
Yeah, sorry, but
No,
I'm
please,
just
yeah.
going to read it. For a Type E corporation authorized to be created by a municipality with a population of 20,000 or less, which is the City of Bastrop. Project also includes land, buildings, equipment, facilities. This is the key word, expenditures. That's not always present. Targeted infrastructure and improvements found by the corporation's board of directors to promote new or expanded business development. And that's the language in the statute. That's section 505.158 of the local government code. And so to the extent that you want to do those, you want to job training, sort of workforce development projects, and you want to use that section, we're going to have those findings that it promotes new or expanded business development. And you're going to have that discussion about why this particular project does and how it fits.
Let me give an example maybe that might help further the conversation. Let's say, okay, given that, Tesla, Neuralink, Samsung and Taylor, all this high-tech stuff going on, and BISD wanted to do a program to make their graduates more conversant in these areas, and they asked us to help by buying computers or some other equipment or machines or whatever. And we found that would, I think that's certainly reasonable to think that would be would enhance the the opportunities and in the business, whatever the whatever legalese you just said. I mean, that seems like that would be pretty reasonable to.
Yeah, because you're not actually giving money to the workforce development, you're actually providing equipment or other things like that. So I guess to John's point, we would need to discuss it on a case-by-case basis. And workforce development is not specifically on the agenda right now. So I think maybe we can, I mean, we talked about the priorities, right? And if we need to manage that or change that, well, that's an appropriate discussion, but we can't really go into too much. We should put it on another agenda item for another meeting to talk about, are we doing it right, are we doing it wrong, so that we're going to be within compliance, right?
Well, and the reason I bring it up here is, you know, before we set it as a priority for the EDC, I just, you know, wanted to ask the legal question and make sure that either the way we're doing it or the way we're planning to do it is going to conform with those requirements.
So the conversation as it relates to career tracks, which is on your agenda, is they do have training that's been identified. They do have partnership agreements with companies where those employees will be set. And so that's, again, us not being the teacher, but being a conduit to get the training in, to get them set. And each one of those employers is a project, so to speak. In that vein, that's how we're getting through career tracks. Our workforce solution is a little bit more nebulous in that they're doing GED preparation and all of the things that are getting folks GED and prep ready. That one we probably have to take a deeper dive. But career tracks, they actually have employers who are ready and willing to receive these folks. So
That's what I was going to say to Kevin when he was giving his scenario, is that I would think that would apply if they could guarantee them job placement in a company in Bastrop.
Well, and that's why I was trying to come up with an example where they likely wouldn't. You know, because yeah, if we partnered with Tesla, let's say, and they wanted to create a training center here in Bastrop, then I would say, yeah, we'll build you the training center, but you're going to agree to, you know, to hire all the graduates, and that, you know, so that, you know, and they'd be open to Bastrop residents or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. I think this just identifies that we need to talk about it some more and with a legal and dedicated agenda item. But it comes up in a couple of contexts, even in the agenda that we have tonight for EDC. The donation of equipment, for instance, was because it was a higher education institution. I just wanted to check legal definitions for that as well. So. Okay, so the purpose of item 5A was for the discussion between the boards and the bodies, and also to provide direction to the city manager and the interim executive director, who happen to be the same person, on how to change that and then bring that back to council. And I think we've covered quite a bit in that vein. So that does move us on to item 6, which is adjournment.
Motion to adjourn on behalf of council.
Second.
We have a motion and a second, so council is now adjourned. And I'll make a motion to adjourn on behalf of EDC.
Yeah, since we're going to be having a meeting after this anyway, right? You second on the motion? Second. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye. We are adjourned. Thank you.